Hi, everyone just joining. Just going to give it a couple of minutes while people log in, and then we'll get started shortly. Hi, everyone just logging in. We're just giving it 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll get started shortly. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Josh Killeen, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. So I work for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, or CPAWS. We're a nationwide environmental organization focused on conservation and protection of public lands across the country. So we actually have 2 chapters in Alberta, Northern and Southern Alberta. And just a note, for the webinar today, there's both a Q&A function and a chat function. So if you want to say hi, say where you're from in the chat function, that's awesome. And then if you'd like to put any of your questions for our speaker, and you can do that at any time throughout the webinar, you can put those into the Q&A box. And then at the end of the talk, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So general chat in the chat box, and then questions for the speaker in the Q&A box. So I'm joining you from Edmonton today, located on Treaty 6 territory and within the homeland of the Otipemisiwak Métis Nation of Alberta. This land has been lived on, traveled, and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work in the traditional territories of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Haudenosaunee, Dene, and Anishinaabe. As a newcomer to Canada, I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to learn from and collaborate with Indigenous peoples and to really reflect on what it means to act in the spirit of reconciliation. And today we're talking about fire. And I think one way or another, we're all affected by wildfires, and how to live with fire is becoming top of mind for more and more people. And we have so much to learn from how Indigenous peoples across Canada and indeed the world utilize and steward fire. So I'm really excited today to have Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson with us to speak to us about Indigenous fire knowledge and stewardship. Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson is Métis. She grew up in Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta, and she works as the Senior Fire Advisor for the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and was formerly a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service and an Indigenous fire specialist in the National Fire Management Division of Parks Canada. She works with nations across Canada on fire stewardship practices like cultural burning, and collaborates with Indigenous peoples from around the world on decolonizing land management. She also studies wildfire evacuations and advocates for Indigenous wildland firefighters. She's the co-author of the books First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, A Guide for Communities and External Agencies, and Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship. She also co-hosts the Good Fire podcast, which looks at Indigenous fire use around the world. It's now on season 3, I believe, and well worth checking out. She serves as a member of the Secretariat of the Thunderbird Collective, an advisor to the Red Fire Lab, a board member of the International Association of Wildland Fire, and a member of the International Research Advisory Panel with Natural Hazards Research Australia. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Amy to share her screen and get started on the talk.
Josh, just let me know if I have any issues sharing here. Can you see that in okay, proper view? Okay, perfect. I see you saying yes. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much today for having me here to speak about a topic that I'm very passionate about. So yeah, as you said, I'm Amy. I currently work for Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and I'm going to get into that and the work that we do in Indigenous-led conservation. I think the first thing that I'm going to focus on is, when we're speaking about Indigenous peoples, what does that actually mean? So for many people, sometimes they'll say things like First Nation and Indigenous peoples, or, that Indigenous peoples and Métis, but in the Canadian Constitution, it basically says that Indigenous peoples in Canada means all three groups. So the First Nations, of which there are hundreds in Canada, many of which that have distinct languages, all of which have distinct cultures, the Métis, and then the Inuit as well. So just so you know, when I'm speaking in this presentation, I'll just use Indigenous people generally, unless I'm speaking specifically about something that only applies to either First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. So this is my family. So I'm from the Cardinal and Labakan families. So on the Cardinal side of my family, we're from a disenfranchised band called the CPAWS band, which means Little Bird in Cree. And we were near Lac La Biche, our band, and we basically participated in the Northwest Rebellion against the Canadian government. And so because of our participation in that, we were disenfranchised as a nation. And so many of the people from our nation spread amongst the Métis settlements, and my family actually ended up going north to Fort McMurray. The other side of my family is the Labakan family, and so they're from the Red River settlement, and they moved west when colonizers came to Canada, and so they were a big group of Métis buffalo hunters, and they settled at the Labakan settlement in kind of Treaty 6 Central Alberta. So my family, the CPAWS band, was signatories on Treaty 6, and so I currently reside in Treaty 6. I live near Rocky Mountain House, Alberta, where I'm speaking from today. And so, yeah, these are my people. They're all actually deceased now. These are the elders in our family, and my cookum and others. And so, yeah, I just am here basically to speak about fire. And so I didn't grow up using fire. My family was one of many Indigenous people in Canada that were basically disconnected from our land due to colonization. And so lots of what I've learned has basically been from an interest in fire and reconnecting with elders from my nation who have always been burning. And so when we look at wildland fire evacuations across Canada, we really, as you guys know, have been seeing in the news, there's been a lot of concern now, but Canada has always had evacuations from fires. And so basically every summer since 1980, there has been evacuations. There are more now. The frequency of evacuations is increasing. And this map shows, again, how they're spread across Canada. So many people think that wildfire is only like a Western Canada problem, but really it's all across Canada that we're experiencing impacts from wildfire. And so I really like looking at wildfire evacuations because lots of times people will just look at area burned for looking at the impacts of fire. But sometimes, like a little fire that's near a community can have really bad human impacts compared to like a very large fire that's kind of burning in a much more remote area. So when we look at these, the size of the dots indicates the number of people who were in that evacuation event. So the orange dots are of Indigenous communities. You can really see throughout the boreal forest, so the area here where almost all the orange dots are, that's really where Indigenous communities are repeatedly evacuated due to wildland fires. Many of these communities are fly-in only, so they require aircraft basically to be removed from their community, or they have to evacuate by boat or by other means to get out of the way. Another hot spot, I guess, that we see for fires is in the interior of British Columbia. And so there we see a big impact on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, and especially since 2017, where we've seen more and more fires. But what I really want to point out from this is that about 5% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous. So that's First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. But even less of those people of that population live in communities that are of high risk to fire. For example, we have a lot of urban Indigenous people right now, yet 42% of wildfire evacuation events have impacted Indigenous communities. So what we see there is a real disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples, but we're frequently left out of any sort of decision making about a fire that eventually impacts our communities. So this map, you probably can't read all the little writing, so don't worry about that. Just kind of concentrate on the numbers. This is showing repeat evacuations. So in the last, from 1980 to 2021, communities that have been evacuated, more than once. So you can see some communities have been evacuated from wildland fire 7 times, 6 times, 5 times. And all of these except one are First Nation communities. So the only one that isn't is West Kelowna, British Columbia, that was evacuated 5 times. But I mean, lots of these too are also experiencing impacts of flooding and other things which aren't included here. But again, really showing that disproportionate impact, and that it's all, lots of times our communities that are carrying the burden of the mismanagement of fire. And so we have a partnership called the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, which is a research partnership with some different First Nations, a bunch of agency partners, and the University of Alberta, where we really work with communities to document experiences of wildfire evacuations and work towards changing things. And so one thing that if you're interested in First Nation evacuations, we wrote a book called First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, a guide for communities and external agencies. And this focuses on different issues that that First Nations face when evacuated. So we spoke to over 200 evacuees from very complex evacuation events who shared stories with us. And it's not all, I mean, there is a lot of bad things that happen, but there's also a lot of good things that the communities do, where they, have strengths in their community and on Indigenous knowledge, where they've lessened the impact. And so the book basically follows stages of the evacuation. So from first seeing a fire near a community, to knowing that you have to evacuate, to actually evacuating, to staying in a host community, and then to returning home. And lots of times, we think when evacuees are repatriated or returned to their community, that's, when everything's good. But what we've seen is that there's still a lot of trauma in these communities after a fire. And lots of times homes are still standing, but landscapes that they depend on for cultural resources can be devastated, which they need support for. And so I saw that Hannah Lima is on the call, and Hannah is our community engagement specialist with First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. And if anybody has any interest in that or anything, you can get a hold of us, and we'll direct you to kind of work we're doing or some resources. So on the right here is a map of the Elephant Hill fire that happened in British Columbia in 2017, and it follows the progression of the fire as it expanded through multiple Indigenous territories. You can see the growth there as the fire is kind of moving. It makes large jumps, but it basically shows that entire area that was used for purposes, for cultural purposes by the nation, was basically burned in very high severity, high intensity fire. And this leads to increased flooding, other things like that. And that the community, 8 years later, I work with some of the people who studied the community impacts of that fire, and they say their community is still struggling from that wildfire event. And of course, all the communities around there were evacuated when that happened. So what's increasing the fire risk? Why are we seeing this? And lots of times the media points to climate change, and that's very true. Climate change is happening. It's human caused. We're seeing a lot of hotter weather, of drier weather, of increasing wind, of more lightning strikes on the land. But what's really happened is almost a worst case scenario where we also have a landscape like mismanagement that has been is now prone to fire. And so when we combine that with climate change, it's really leading to the scenario we see now. So, we've had fire exclusion from fire dependent forests. And so I've oftentimes heard people say, like, that fire is a disturbance on the landscape, but it's really actually been the exclusion of fire that's been the bigger disturbance on the landscape in these fire dependent forests like the boreal. We also have fire suppression. So when fires do start, we're trying to put them out all the time. Recently, we've kind of returned to these or started these let it burn policies where sometimes they'll let fires go. But for the most part, we still are very strong on fire suppression and very good at it, to be honest, in Canada too. For the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were excellent at fire suppression. But what it's caused is a big buildup of vegetation, again, in these fire-dependent forests that need fire. There's also been significant kind of landscape changes, forest management practices that have occurred, including, logging, cut blocks, leaving slash, chopping up the land. And then also one thing I want to point out as well is that, wilderness or conservation movements have also been harmful. For example, they oftentimes remove humans or us from the landscape, and we're such an important and vital part of like keeping and stewarding healthy landscapes, which I'm going to get into in a bit. And so even now when, a lot of times we're trying to correct problems that have happened from, excluding fire and other things where we have this increase of vegetation, we'll often have conservation groups come in that say, no, this is natural. We're not changing this. This is what we're, what nature is supposed to look like, but really it's not. An example I often give too is like when you go to Banff, and you stand up and you see that like carpet of green coniferous trees on the landscape, the pines, the spruce and stuff. People think like, oh, wow, this is a beautiful natural forest. But really, it's not. It's an unhealthy forest, and I'm going to get into that soon. We've also had expansion of the wildland-urban interface, so more people living in the landscape in areas that are high risk to fire, and about 60% of First Nation reserves are located within or intersect the wildland-human interface, which is kind of an area where we are at more risk to seeing human impact of wildfire. So what is Indigenous fire stewardship? I get this question a lot, and it's basically any activity where Indigenous people assert their rights over stewardship of fires in their territory. So of course, the most popular one lately that we hear about is cultural burning practices that communities are doing, but there's also, Indigenous-led decision-making over values protection. So, when we're doing firefighting, what should we do? What should we be protecting? Is a home worth protecting, or is like a part of the ecosystem? Is there an archaeological site? Are there other things that also maybe it might be protected? There's Indigenous-led community preparedness projects where communities identify, the needs of their nation and incorporated that into community preparedness plans. There's Indigenous-led firefighting teams, contract firefighters, and of course, Indigenous-led emergency management. And so a group I work with often is the Red Fire Lab. This is a piece of art from that group, and that's a lab that's really focused on Indigenous fire stewardship and research to support it. So what is Indigenous cultural burning? So one of the best definitions or easiest ways I've seen to describe it is from Stephen Pine, who's actually a white historian, but he did capture it well that Indigenous peoples were wanted to replace fires of chance with fires of choice. And so when I speak with elders, it's often we hear this term cleaning the land. That was actually when I first got really interested in it. I was always hearing elders saying we need to clean the land. And I didn't understand what that meant at first, that what they were actually talking about was using fire to clean the land. So to remove kind of dead, downed, and unhealthy vegetation. And so we use fires then to achieve specific cultural objectives. So one elder from Northern Alberta said, I didn't set the forest on fire just for the sake of burning, but so that I could return to hunt the next year and live. And there's actually, we're very lucky, especially in Northern Alberta, is that a researcher named Henry Lewis came from California, and he was at the University of Alberta, and he documented Indigenous burning practices in Northern Alberta in the 1970s. And so he has various publications. He has a film called Fires of Spring. You can search it on YouTube. People have posted it on there, that where he interviewed elders then. So that was like, when I think back, that was 50 years ago. And it's like, what if we would have listened to those elders and what they were sharing with Dr. Lewis back then? But if you're interested, that's a really good way to, look kind of back at the practice from, a lens of people who aren't here anymore. So on the left is a picture of Indigenous people demonstrating a prairie fire start. So it doesn't say, but I would guess, we're guessing this is probably from the Blackfoot Nation. They have, the Blackfoot Nations, they have a very significant relationship with fire down there. We're working with quite a few now on reestablishing that link to fire, like the Piikani Nation and others. And on the right is a modern, I shouldn't say a modern burn, but a recent burn in Cumberland House that some Métis youth actually did. And you can see there the relationship with fire and snow. Like for them, a good time to burn is when there's still snow on the ground. And I mean, even for us in Northern Alberta, that the snow basically dictated when and how we would burn. You wanted snow on the ground when you were putting fire because it acted as natural fire break. So another thing I often hear is like, well, what is the difference then between cultural burning and prescribed fire? So many wildland fire management agencies have prescribed fire programs. And so I worked with Parks Canada as the Indigenous fire specialist for a few years. And we basically had a program there where we developed an Indigenous fire circle. And with that, we kind of worked with that group to come up with, well, what is the difference for people around Indigenous fire compared to prescribed fire? So it's Indigenous led around cultural objectives, land stewardship. We want to create mosaics on the landscape, which I'll talk about in a bit. It reduces risk. It includes spiritual and ceremonial aspects. It's Indigenous knowledge driven around the time to burn and techniques for burning. And generally, it's slow, cool burns, fires we can walk beside, although sometimes communities do want to burn for higher intensity reasons. There's community roles or traditional governments, community involvement. So sometimes in different nations, they actually had specific fire keeping families who would be the ones who would, choose when and where to put fire on the ground and for what reasons. It's ignition using traditional methods. So, trying not to introduce like gasoline, diesel, other things to the environment, especially when you're burning for specific types of ceremonial plants. It's more than fire. It's about us. It's about, having culture and being able to go to these healthy landscapes to practice our culture on. It's that fire is actually just a small part of it. And it's about living with the land. Whereas for prescribed fire, it's agency and organization driven. Its objectives are usually around hazard reduction or ecological, but a lot of hazard reduction burning is done in Canada. It's also sometimes referred to as production burning. So where they're trying to do as much in as little a time as possible, get a lot of fire on the ground, lots of times doing crown fire replication. So oftentimes varying in intensity of fires that they want to do. There's a paramilitary structure, a top-down approach. It's very bureaucratic if you've ever been on a agency prescribed fire. Ignition using accelerants. So lots of times like, using heli torches or ping pong balls, drip torches, other things like that to put fire on the landscape. It's a job. So people come in, they're given, a task to do. That's what they do. And they basically work off the land. And lots of times there's no, I heard from one elder, they were saying, we will be here and our nation will be here long after all these agency staff have moved on and moved away to other jobs or retired or things. So that's to them why cultural fire was so important. So we did I mentioned Cumberland House before. There's a great team up there with the Carrier family and other folks who are very passionate about cultural fire, and they've never stopped burning. Like, that's one thing we often hear, is that, you know, there's been a loss of knowledge of cultural fire. And like, yes, there has, but there's also these pockets where people have been burning the entire time. And so we worked with their community to develop what we call like a toolkit, but it's basically a website, wearefire.ca. And you can go through and find tons of different information about Indigenous fire, about the Cumberland House, understanding the politics, like different legislation and other things that keeps Indigenous people from burning, moving towards what they call their fire reconciliation, and then moving towards Indigenous-led fire prescriptions. And one really cool thing about this website is that it's all translated into Cree, and it's all in audio. So you can click on, just below this paragraph in Cree here, there's like a little audio button. You can click on it and it'll basically read the Cree for you, and then it'll translate it into English. So the entire website is done like that. And so it's a really great way for Cree speakers and other people, and then for those of us to learn as well. And so I should say too, that, sorry, Cumberland House is in the Saskatchewan River Delta, which is just a beautiful and unique place. So I have a video here. I'm going to try and play it. Josh, can you let me know if you can't hear the audio? And if you can't, then I'll just stop it.
I have lived here in this area my whole life. Something that my parents instilled in me from a very young age is that fire is a tool to manage the land.
When I was a kid, it was so rich with life. My father taught me these methods of trying to give back the land by burning unwanted weeds, so we could try to bring back the good plants that muskrats and moose and elk, deer need. And now we don't have that.
Indigenous people had these intricate systems of managing and planning fire, but the government has continued interfered with the sovereignty in managing our own lands.
My girl, Michaela, and my family were always questioning why the muskrats aren't here anymore. And we had a colleague suggest that we do our own scientific study. So we did that, and in those 4 lakes, we burned half the lake, and we didn't burn the other half. When we went back in the fall and took samples, we found that where we didn't burn, there's primarily 4 plant species. And most in that area were grasses that are not used by animals. In the spring, when we harvested muskrat on both sides, on the non-burn side, the muskrats were 700 to 900 grams. And on the burnt side, they were 1,600 grams to 1,800 grams. So within just one season, you could tell that the burnt areas were quite productive because of how big the muskrats were. So that kind of convinced us to bring back the practice, to burn the land, to revitalize it. I seen it work.
Today, when I was lighting the torch and burning the grasses, that felt like carrying on the torch of my ancestors. So it was a really cool, powerful moment to take this ancient system, this ancient knowledge, and apply it to the land.
It makes me feel very good because I'm now carrying on the practice that my father taught me, and I'm able to share it with other people, that hopefully in the future that we continue this practice.
This project started pretty small, like it was really just about the muskrats, and now it's actually gained momentum, and now we're actually teaching other Indigenous communities about these methods. It's not just going to be us, it's going to be a whole network.
Okay, so I think one thing I didn't mention there was that they have a huge invasive plant problem with those Phragmites that you saw in the video. And those are the ones that Solomon was talking about, that the animals can't actually eat. They have very low nutritional content for them. And so with burning, they've actually shown that this repeated burning actually basically eliminates Phragmites from areas and allows like the natural or the local plants, native plants, to come up there. So Indigenous knowledge systems have been shown in multiple studies, to steward biodiversity, to provide nature-based solutions to climate change, and to reduce risk from disaster. Yet, Indigenous people are still continually left out of any sort of management decisions, despite all this kind of good, like Western scientific evidence. And so for me, as a younger researcher starting on this field, I kind of thought, like, if we just do like one or two good studies that really show, what cultural burning can do and how impactful it is, that will change things. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that we're producing a lot of good evidence, but it's really still very slow to change. And so what we really saw historically after colonization was this basically cultural severance of Indigenous people from their knowledge. And so in fire, that was because of these fire exclusion or suppression campaigns. So wildfire management agencies that came in, I think the earliest anti-fire campaign was actually in 1610 in Newfoundland, where they said that people can't burn anymore. So they basically racialized light burning and delegitimized or erased Indigenous people and knowledge through three key narratives. So they basically discredited that fire was useful or good on the landscape, that whole idea of the savage narrative that, they were coming from Europe with superior ideas of how to manage the landscape, downplaying this whole idea of this vanishing Indian narrative that, we weren't around, there wasn't enough of us to steward an environment. Of course, that if we couldn't have stewarded like the entire boreal forest. And then this idea of erasure. So the whole terra nullius narrative that we hear often, that this was empty land, Indigenous people weren't managing it, we were just kind of surviving as best that we could. And so this is in a really great article by Kristen Vignetta, the links there if anybody wants to see about under the guise of science, how the US Forest Service deployed setter, colonial, and racist logics to advance an unsubstantiated fire suppression agenda. So it's very, very direct, but we see the exact same thing in Canada that happened, where the knowledge of Indigenous people was completely discredited. And so that's why I have a hard time when people say like, oh, well, you lost your knowledge about cultural fire. Well, like we didn't, as Victor Stephenson says, like we didn't just drop it on the ground. It was basically ripped from us and from our communities through different policies. So, we had residential schools, we had the Indian Act where Indigenous people weren't allowed to go out on the land anymore, and the creation of the reserve system. We had the 60s scoop and other things that remove people from their territories. And then basically that fire was made illegal. So, people were arrested or charged or fined for setting fires. So this is to give an example again of kind of what's happened since the fire exclusion began in Canada. So on the top, you can see what I would call like a much more healthier landscape. So this is one where it's very rich in diversity. So you can see like all the way to the forest floor, you can see meadows, you can see different type of trees everywhere. This basically makes it easy for people and animals to move through different areas. You also have like kind of pockets of older growth forests that would have been really helpful for, getting different cultural resources or for animals. When we go to the middle one, that's where we basically see where fire suppression started. So instead of seeing that like mosaic or diversity on the landscape, we start to see this kind of everything kind of going to the same stage. These like monocultures where everything is starting to move towards these like late succession forests, lots of, older, like I was saying, coniferous trees there. And it's what our elders kind of, as I said, call hungry forests. So you have to go much further to get a diversity of resources than if you were living in kind of that top scenario. And then on the bottom is what we see is then you have these out of control fires that happen. So in the top image, you can see that there's kind of two little fires that have started on the landscape, one probably by people, one in the background by lightning, which was a great teacher for us. And as they're moving, there's lots of natural fire breaks on the landscape where the fires can move, but they don't burn as great through grass or other areas, or there was beaver on the landscape everywhere. Whereas on the bottom, there's really no natural fire breaks. It's a lot of monoculture type of trees. So the fire can just really rip across the landscape much easier. And so most of you might be familiar with the Mountain Legacy project. And so these are images from there that really show the change in basically the landscape cover, the forest cover that we're seeing. And these are all near where I am in Rocky Mountain House. So this is just one looking out on the land. I can't remember, I had the date somewhere here, but anyways, they're from the early 1900s. And then this is now like what we see now. And so this is just to show, like, you can't even see the view because we've had so much growth come in. Again, and fire loves these kind of conifer trees, loves pine, loves spruce, and spreads really well through that. So here's another example. This is where you can see like those mosaics on the landscape. You can really see through to the forest floor in some places. You can see a lot more patchwork meadows, especially like when you look in the distance there. And then when we look here, this is current. Pretty much the only thing now to break up that landscape is the road. And so when you can imagine, like if you lived in that area, how far you would have to go to get like different types of things, like say you wanted sage or a certain type of berries or other things. Whereas in this other picture, you can see that there was a bunch of different types of ecosystems on the landscape that you could go to harvest resources. But here again, it's very similar landscape through that whole area. So we wrote a book called an article called Centering Indigenous Voices, the Role of Fire in the Boreal Forests of North America. And what this did was look to center things that have been written about Indigenous people. So rather than having like tree ring studies or other things like that being done about us, where they kind of guess about how we're managing fire, this is actually documented from Indigenous people and from what they've shared about what happened in their landscape. So within that article, it's open access. There's a table that has over 36 species in the Boreal that were known to have been managed with Indigenous burning practices. And so you can see there low bush blueberry, what nations are documented at burning for it, the names, where people were burning for it, and then the reasons why people were burning. So, how the burning worked to help improve the production, and then key references you can click on for where those come from. Another resource that we have is the Blazing the Trail booklet. It's a product of Fire Smart Canada, and it was written by 10 Indigenous fire knowledge holders and peer-reviewed by about, I think, 14 more Indigenous fire knowledge holders. And it goes through and talks about what Indigenous fire stewardship is, and then gives case studies of 11 different communities. So for us, like, there's no real, like, this is what a community should be doing to reduce their fire risk, to using Indigenous fire stewardship. Like, every community, every nation is totally different in how they apply fire to the land, how they use fire, how they want to reduce their fire risk, how they want to fire having a role on the landscape. So that's kind of what this book gets into. So as I mentioned before, I now work for Indigenous Leadership Initiative. Indigenous Leadership Initiative is basically a campaign that advocates about and convenes about different issues that are important to Indigenous people with conservation. And so one really popular movement that they have is the Land Needs Guardians. And so since ILI has started advocating in this area, we've gone from only having a few guardian programs in Canada to having, I think, over 200 now, and hopefully to continue that and to continue the growth. So one thing that we're really focused on as well is fire, and this idea of renewed fire kinship for our nations, and how that can work and be done basically by guardians in their local territories. And so our big goals are, increasing fire capacity, increasing Indigenous knowledge sovereignty, recognizing Indigenous fire governance, and then living in landscapes of abundance and health. So we've done a bunch of different things. We have an Indigenous fire stewardship, what we call like the state of play, but basically what people are doing in fire. There's a lot of interest in, still kind of that paternalistic attitude of people that want to help Indigenous folks, and a lot of funding doesn't actually go to Indigenous nations. It goes to these kind of non-Indigenous groups, government groups, others to kind of, help us or assist us in doing these things, or researchers who want to study us more. And so what we tried to do there was compile, what's actually going on, because there does seem like there's a lot of money, but very little of it's actually getting to communities. And so we worked with the Prince Albert Grand Council, we worked with the Blood Tribe, we worked with the Innu Nation, a bunch of others on looking at what they want to do in terms of fire in their region and how we can support them. And so Prince Albert Grand Council had a great project about equality of laws, where they looked at, what's keeping them from burning, what's the policies that exist there, and they recommended changes to all those policies to be put forward. The Blood Tribe is actually the first, they just got funding to have a fire guardian program there. So that's where Indigenous people from their nation will be employed year round in fire. So rather than looking at fire as a seasonal activity, it's having people on the ground all year doing planning, mitigation, burning, response, and then response, like when fires do happen or when they need somebody there. An initiative that I'm really proud of is the Thunderbird Collective. So this is basically a national working group on Indigenous fire stewardship. And so we have representation from all across Canada on our steering committee. We're going to be launching different things like a national fire camp. We're going to be having funding for supporting regional and local gatherings that people want to do about fire, or we can support them. We're going to try to accelerate training by giving scholarships for people, by creating training opportunities, by funding exchanges where people can go and learn from folks like in Australia or in California who already have very good cultural fire programs in their nations. And so our website should be launching for that, hopefully like in the summer for the Thunderbird Collective. So stay tuned for that. We're just signing kind of our funding agreement for the next 4 years. And so the Thunderbird Collective is actually housed within the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, but it's a great way to bring people together. A lot of times, like nations, they'll want to burn, they'll want to have their own firefighting crews, they'll want to do things, but they hit barriers repeatedly. And instead of trying to eliminate those barriers, you find sneaky ways to go around them. But the whole idea of the Thunderbird Collective is that, because it's more of a national group, we can take on some of these more difficult issues like, Indigenous-led training of firefighters, certification of cultural burners, looking at different higher level policy and regulations and begin to address those. So a lot of people say like, oh yeah, this just seems like pretty easy. Why don't we just do it? Well, there's a lot of issues that we still deal with all the time. So there's still a very low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire. As I mentioned before, lots of people will say like, well, you lost your knowledge, or this might have been fine before climate change, or like people, we had a bunch of infrastructure here, but now things have changed. And I think the biggest thing to point out is, we're still here, we're still living on these landscapes. Like who has noticed the impacts of climate change more than Indigenous peoples who live in those landscapes every day? And one thing I constantly hear from elders is, that, yeah, we're going to have to change how we do things. Like they know that the fuel load out there is super high and that we might have to bring in like mechanical thinning and other things before we can start to do cultural fire safely again. So there's also huge power dynamics at play. So, everyone hates to give up power and funding. And there's also issues here related to Indigenous sovereignty and land back. So for example, if we say like, okay, and a nation has can burn, like nations right now can kind of burn on their reserves with smaller oversight. But if they wanted to go like on crown land in their territory, they're basically not allowed to burn. And so suddenly if maybe a nation was allowed to burn there, well, does that then admit that, the province is then saying that that's their territory? And then there might be other, legal or other repercussions that come from that in terms of land back and other movements. So I think that government tends to still be pretty hesitant basically in those things. There's also a lot of non-Indigenous interest and appropriation, as I mentioned before. A lot of money goes to outside interests, like not to Indigenous peoples directly. There's still no sustained funding 5 years or more for jobs for Indigenous peoples, especially in these kind of fire positions. So a lot of times when I go into agencies, everyone there is employed full time with like full pension and benefits, but we don't have anything like that for fire people or for guardians. and constantly having to chase funding makes it really difficult to, create long-term successful programs that people want to be involved in. So we often have these one-off projects instead, and these overwhelming requests that we get. And lots of times too, like we fail on some of them, right? Because people will just say like, well, we tried to engage with you, but nobody participated. And it doesn't mean that nations don't care. It's just that there's so many things on their plate at the moment. There's also huge issues of social justice around this. So again, it was Indigenous people who were stewarding the territory here. They basically were told, no, you can't do it. We have these current issues that we're seeing. And so for me, a natural thing seems to be like a social justice thing of, okay, let's like work with Indigenous people and start transferring to Indigenous leadership on some of these issues to make up for the past. This whole idea, as we were saying, of reconciliation. So I just wanted to point, I think that's my last slide. Some of the art throughout this was done by a youth named Jordan Twist, who works for the Red Fire Lab and has done amazing art and allowed me to use them for this presentation. And the last thing I guess I'll mention is the Good Fire podcast that Josh mentioned. It's available on all podcast platforms. We currently have 3 seasons. The first is the Good Fire season. The second is the Fire Back. And the third season comes out March 6th. And it's the Matriarch season, where we speak with Indigenous women. And so we basically have different guests each episode, international guests from Africa, Peru, Guyana, Australia, the US, all over Canada, where we talk about Indigenous fire and basically share kind of best practices. So yeah, you can check that out if you're interested. So I'll just stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was a great presentation. It was super interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting to hear about all these positive initiatives you're working on as well. That's really, it's really cool stuff. So we're going to have a little Q&A session. So please do put your questions into the Q&A or in the chat is fine too, and I can read those out. And while you folks are typing, I'll start us off with a question. Yeah, you talked a little bit about this idea of decision-making over values protection. And I was kind of intrigued by that. I was wondering if you could expand on, like, what does that look like when you see a shift in values protection when you're managing in an area and moving to Indigenous decision-making?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things, and the example that I often use, and some of it comes from my colleague Alex Sahara wrote a great paper on it, looking at Saskatchewan and the whole idea of Indigenous-led values is, for example, like say there's, fire management agencies love to protect structures, right? Like that's their thing. And so they'll say like, we deployed sprinkler systems, all these things. And I mean, it's great. It's super important. We need to do that. But one thing that I always find it like quite odd is many times they'll like set up like for trappers cabins, for example. So, someone has an older trappers cabin in the middle of the bush. They'll go and spend a lot of resources doing like sprinkler protection, doing other sorts of work for that trappers cabin, but yet the entire area around it hasn't been allowed to be managed. It'll, nowadays we're seeing a lot of high severity, high intensity fires going through that will basically devastate that landscape for trapping for, the next century. So, we're saving the cabin, but the landscape around it that the cabin depends on is basically non-functioning. So, is it worth then to spend all those resources, on solely protecting the structure that's there? So that's kind of some of the issues that, we get into. And that's not to say like, let's just let all the trappers cabins burn. That's not what we mean. But, why don't we set up a better, preventative system where, trappers were one of the #1 cultural burners, like Indigenous trappers, because it was so important. Like, let's bring back that practice. Let's teach trappers again about cultural fire, use it around their cabins. And then, so I think that's the whole idea we're getting into. Another thing is like different archaeologic sites, right? Like there is a bit of an issue here because many nations don't want to share like their important ceremonial or archaeologic sites with the government. So then when a fire does happen, lots of times areas are burned because the agency just might not know that they even exist there. So it's about this like building relationship and building trust. And in California, what they have is like cultural fire advisors that actually sit on incident management teams. So therefore, then the agency doesn't have to have access to that data, but the cultural fire advisor does. And then they can direct the management agency around like those kind of cultural things that are important without, the whole issues with, intellectual property of cultural data.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I got a question here from Don. He asks, what inroads, if any, are you making to educate the orders of government about the need to allow Indigenous peoples the ability to govern fire on the land? It seems this is an important and overlooked management issue that has prevented putting fire governance back in the hands of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so I mean, we're trying to advocate. We hope that the Thunderbird Collective and the work that ILI and other groups like the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council will continue to put pressure. As I was saying in the issue section of the presentation, nobody wants to give up funding or power. And I think there's also a lot of like misunderstanding about like I've heard in government meetings, like, well, if we let you guys start burning, and Indians are just going to be setting fires all over the place. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not how our cultural fire, systems work. But again, it's that lack of understanding and honestly, the structural racism that we have in a lot of our institutions around fire. And so, I think we're trying to make inroads. I think that agencies have really opened up. Like I said, with Parks Canada, I worked there as their Indigenous fire specialist. So, I mean, even the fact that that position exists is a huge change. And I know like BC Wildfire, other groups are also having similar positions like that. But one thing that we see is a lot of times like the agencies want to maybe not appropriate, but they want to like learn from Indigenous people. And then they take the things that they like from it, but they remove like all the cultural and spiritual and Indigenous leadership and just put that into like, reinforcing what they're already doing. So like prescribed fire, for example, whereas prescribed fire, as I mentioned, leaves out a whole bunch of other important aspects. And so we have like elders basically that will go and teach folks at different agencies about fire and, cultural fire and other things. But so they're allowed to teach those people are allowed to go out and put fire on the landscape, but those elders aren't. So it's a really like odd system, I think, that we're living in right now where, we're continually trying to make inroads, but it's, yeah, I would say it's difficult. Like sometimes I get pretty like frustrated with it, but I'm still hoping, with these national movements that we're starting, that we'll start continuing to put pressure in these areas.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is about how do we get community members of First Nations engaged in these initiatives when it seems their community members are already so stretched, while not wanting to default to bringing in non-Indigenous folks? So how do we get qualified cultural firefighters, project management, engagement?
Yeah, great question. So I think, we have, basically, I didn't mention it, but like when I worked in Northern Alberta with a few of the different Métis settlements, like it was crazy. There was like 95% of the men there that were over the age of 30 were wildland firefighters, like had experience doing that. And many of the women did as well, because back in like the 70s and 80s, when they used to go out firefighting, they used to like take their whole families and they would go set up fire camps. The women would either be firefighters or be like cooks in the camp or other things like that. And so there's a lot like, and I find when I go to communities, there's such high interest in fire. The one issue that we're having though is that there's just like not the permanent sustainable jobs for people. So for like Northern Alberta, for example, right? Like you're competing against the oil field and other things like that can offer people, long-term sustainable careers. Whereas, maybe for me, I could get project funding for 6 months for like a fire guardian. And then, but who are you going to get to fill that position? So that's been, I think, one of the most frustrating things for me is like, but lots of times then we're judged based on that, right? Well, when we're not given the same opportunities. So we're really trying to advocate for this increased funding. And then another thing that we're really working on is like accelerating the opportunities for training or for knowledge sharing. So as I was saying with Thunderbird Collective, we're going to be having these national fire camps, supporting regional gatherings, and getting people, you know, really back and interested in sharing knowledge about fire. But I would say my problem, or I shouldn't say my, but our problem at the moment is there's so much interest and there's just no funds.
Then we have one more question from Wesley, and it's about, you mentioned a little bit about some of the barriers you see to enabling Indigenous cultural burning practices in Alberta specifically.
Yeah.
Like, where have you seen success in starting to change that paradigm with the bureaucracy and the power dynamics and so on?
Yeah, so Alberta is a hard one. I think we've seen better success in other provinces, and like especially with like the current administration or government that we have. So I think, you know, on reserve nations, or like on settlement, on Métis settlements, like nations can have prescribed fire. They can do that. Again, there's a massive issue with funding here, is that, you know, we need people that are trained and you know, able to do this type of work. And we haven't been able to kind of source the long-term sustained funding that we would need for that. There's like, basically right now, Indigenous people can't go out and just, you know, burn on Crown land, right? That's considered an illegal activity. And for many, with Alberta wildfire, like I know even sometimes nations feel like Alberta wildfire like oversteps on. So even if they wanted to do a cultural fire on their reserve, which they're supposed to be allowed by Indigenous Services Canada, they feel like, you know, nervous to do it because they feel like Alberta wildfire will just come in and put out the fire, make a production or something. And again, that depends on the relationship between like the local nation and then like the regional wildland fire group there. So I think like for me, yeah, Alberta's a bit of a hard one, especially at the moment. So currently, like in their provincial regulations and law, it's that, you know, only people with certain training working in Alberta wildfire can do this type of work. And so that's one thing, you know, we need to address and try to change.
Thank you. And then I think we've got time for one more question. So from William, who says the city of Edmonton is planning to help coordinate a cultural burning program in the coming years. The city would provide resources to help ensure that fires don't escape burn areas. And we're planning on inviting some highly skilled Indigenous wildland firefighters as well. We understand that the program must be led by Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. Do you have any advice or words of wisdom to help with this initiative?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that's really exciting. And great. I think that's the thing for me that's always the hope, is like sometimes when we look at provincial or federal, it's just so difficult. There's just so many barriers in the way, but it's really local initiatives like this that's where we're really making good and important successes. So yeah, that's awesome. And I think too, yeah, you can email me or something, and I can maybe send you some advice of different elders or other people that I have in that region that could potentially help. I think, as you know, being with the city of Edmonton, it's important to get like the local territorial or like the people whose territory is in that region involved. And I'm just trying to think actually if I know anyone specifically from those areas. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear more, I guess, is the best thing for that one. Well, and we could maybe have a chat on it, and I could chat with you, because I was just wondering too about your just how often you'll be doing the burns and everything like that. And yeah, if you're planning to do more of a ceremonial aspect to the burns or what. So yeah, so maybe let's keep, I can put my email in the chat here. Oops, sorry. Dang it, I pressed the button instead of the 1 second coming.
Perfect. That's
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, so one way, like easier way, is like private land, right? Or land owned by cities or municipalities, that kind of we can get around some of these different regulations. And that's a good place to start, really, and start showing best practices of what this can be.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. I think we're about at time, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for the presentation, Amy. And thank you all for attending and listening and asking some great questions as well. And have a great afternoon.